I can, and probably the best way for me to describe this is if you looked at what the 2020 target is. So what is the emissions target that AB 32 required that we set the target to 1990 emission levels? That's 431 million metric tons. That's the target that we're aiming to get at in 2020. If you look at what business as usual was without the range of policies that you just talked about, that's about 509 million metric tons. So you have about 80 million metric ton reduction to get to the 2020 target. So then if you ask the question, well, what are the strategies that make up those reductions? And what share is owned, for instance, by those policies you just talked about? So if you look at the energy policies, the renewable portfolio strategy getting from 20 to 33%, and the energy efficiency, kind of the energy-related strategies, they translate into about a third of that, about 30% of that 80 million metric ton reduction. The transportation-related strategies, including the Advanced Clean Car program that you just talked about, that's about 30% as well, right in that ballpark. The low-carbon fuel standard is about 25%. And then if you look at some of the other strategies, like the high GWP refrigerants, going to lower GWP refrigerants that are very potent greenhouse gases, reducing methane emissions from landfills, that tends to make the difference up. And to your fundamental question, are these programs working? The GHG emissions that we're seeing by virtue of cleaner vehicles are much more economical. They're getting better fuel economy. The low carbon fuel standard is bringing in cleaner fuels to California that are being developed and reducing the methane from landfills. So point by point, if you look at example, and it's a fair point, are we, with respect to implementation of some of these policies, you're right, we're relatively early in, and we carefully need to continue to monitor and have annual reporting under the programs. But by every measure, both in terms of the design of the policies and the annual reporting and the ability to effectively track them, the answer was, or is, that we're on track to meet the 2020 reduction target.
Okay, so very important programs, obviously cost a lot of money. Can you tell me what ARB has budgeted for each one of those? I mean, how much do we spend as a state trying to implement those 4 policies? Do you have that information?
Well, I'm going to back up and tell me if this is not responsive to the question, but as best I can answer this. When we look at, and it goes back to a question that the chairman asked me in terms of, well, before you, as part of developing a policy, do you do overall economic analysis? And the answer is absolutely. You've got to have as best an answer as possible in terms of what are the costs, what are the benefits? And clearly, when you look well out into the future, there are clearly uncertainties, and it's important for that analysis to capture those uncertainties as best we possibly can. But each of those policies looks at that question in terms of costs and benefits. And then in fact, one of the things that we've done as part of working with economists, economic advisors, internal and external, on the recent update to the scoping plan was look at, well, how do the policies collectively, because there's some interactions, what does it tell us about the costs? How can we be more effective at monitoring the impacts? Because this is something, a question that I posed to a number of external economists and asked for advice in terms of monitoring as we go forward. And it's a really interesting question, because the response that many provide is, California's a very large economy. It's a $2 trillion economy. The policies, even though they're very important and significant relative to the size of the economy, they're very difficult to tease out. So there's been independent economic work that have looked at this question, a number of studies, and generally the response or the assessment is that the impacts of the policy, that one, the California economy will continue to grow. California economy is very large relative to the policies. And the policies will have a small impact. Some say a small cost. There's some, now some would dispute this, but some say a small benefit. But the need to monitor and report and look to have even further refinement of economic analysis ongoing and seek the best minds, the best advice is something we're going to aim to do. We have, and I would very interested in continue to reach for that. Okay.
So far we've generated about $970 million for the auctions for the carbon credits. And I understand, I referenced earlier, 630 million, I think was the February one. So how many auctions are there per year? Is it?
There are 4 auctions per year.
Okay.
We just had our 10th, and the point that I made in my testimony, if you look at the aggregate for dollars deposited in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, resulting from all 10 of those auctions. The first one was November of 2013. So it is about 1.6 billion in the aggregate.
Okay, so if we generate 630 million in February and we have 4 more and roughly that's about $2.5 billion this year. I'm just curious, with, high-speed rail, affordable housing, which confuses me how that's going to reduce greenhouse gases, but I'm sure there's some logic. Rail, low-carbon transit, and then what we appropriate as the legislature, which will be perfect, of course. How much greenhouse gas do you think we'll be able to reduce? That's a lot of money. I mean, that's a lot of money that people are paying in the state. Do any estimates to correlate that between money paid and reduction in greenhouse gases?
And I'm going to, well, let me answer kind of a direct comment, and then I'll go back to a point about the actual number. The policies that, in terms of that are informing the greenhouse gas reduction, basically the use of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, as you noted, those are subject to legislative appropriation. But even if I back out of that, through legislation directed the Department of Finance in consultation with ARB and through a full public process to develop a 3-year investment plan. So it's wired in basically that every 3 years, in fact, ARB with DOF is just beginning that process now because we have a report DOF does to the legislature in January 2016. That really is, the objective is to look at where there are opportunities for smart reductions, where there are opportunities for co-benefits, GHG reductions, but also where there are other co-benefits. My agency, what are the criteria, pollutant or toxic reductions, where there are job opportunities. So as that report was developed in it to help legislative consideration with respect to appropriations, it was about far more than GHG reductions. It was, what are the co-benefits? And 1532 and a series of bills the legislature moved through the process over the last few years are very clear in terms of the importance of not just the GHG question, but in addition to GHG reductions, valuing benefits to disadvantaged communities, valuing benefits on the jobs and economic and criteria pollutant side. But if we look at those appropriations, and I talked a little about the appropriation that ARB got, those are being directly focused on strategies, freight, light-duty vehicles, zero-emission vehicles that are without question delivering GHG benefits. They're also delivering other benefits because we're talking about a source. The transportation sector is responsible for not just 40% of the GHG emissions, it's 80% of the NOx, the emissions that form ozone. And the freight sector, or the heavy-duty sector, is responsible for 95% of the diesel PM.
Okay. Last question. Oh, I'm sorry. So the zero-emission vehicles, so I think there's about rebates for about 95,000, very expensive, $200 million roughly. And the goal is to have about 1.5 million zero-emission vehicles on the road. And hopefully they get down to a range where the people who live in my district can afford them. They're largely focused on the coast at this point with the higher net worth folks. But how much is going to be budgeted? I mean, because at some point, I'm assuming we're going to keep the rebates. And if you look at what the rebate is now versus the number of cars, I mean, it's up like $3 billion. Is that the goal, or is the goal eventually for those cars to just be affordable in general? What's the long-term plan to get those vehicles on the road?
Long-term plan, it's a great question, and that question was embedded in SB 1275 as well, which asked us not to develop what is the long-term strategy. In other words, for the rebates, there's no question they are having an impact in terms of introducing zero-emission vehicles into California. We're seeing an uptake like we have not seen. We're seeing the number of zero-emission vehicles, zero-emission battery electric vehicles offered just a few years ago. You had 1 or 2. 2015, we have 15. And these are cars that people actually want. Yeah. The range is getting better and better. These are really vehicles that work for average folks. Now, I get the fact that there's the 1275 also talked about even more focus on directing the benefits of zero-emission vehicles to disadvantaged communities. And I mentioned a number of programs that we're working on to make them more affordable and to also work in the secondary market, how that's going to work. But our proposed budget, the governor's proposed budget for the clean transportation provision for the program that we're advancing is the same as last year, and it's just using those dollars as smart and effectively as we can. Our view is rebates are going to be needed for a while, but we're very optimistic in terms of the uptake of vehicles and the number of offerings and how and the ramp up that we're seeing, the rapid ramp up in terms of models that are being offered and the uptake of vehicles. We're encouraged.
Well, I hope so, because, these zero-emission vehicles in the coast, the air's pretty clean there already. In the valley, where a lot of the folks can't afford them, that's where we struggle with air quality the most. So whatever we can do to get those vehicles in the valley would be great. So thank you.
This is just a question that has a little bit to do with your affordable housing comment. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the guidance on maximizing benefits to disadvantaged communities. I know it's been alluded to a little bit, but to dig in a little deeper, I'm very interested in everything you said about supporting transit. We have an enormous transit crisis in Southern California. Of course, it exists in many parts of the state, and think that it's a very appropriate use of cap and trade funds, and I hope that a significant amount of money goes toward those kinds of projects, because I think there's a very clear direct relation and connection. But I wanted to talk a little bit about whether the guidance for maximizing benefits to historically disadvantaged communities takes into account both where residents work as well as where they live. For instance, many more inland residents from disadvantaged neighborhoods travel every day to the west side in Los Angeles, and there are similar patterns going on all over the state, particularly in our urban areas, just to make a living. And I'm just concerned that there may not be enough affordable, I know there are not enough affordable low carbon transit and transportation options available to them. And so I wanted to kind of get a sense of how commuting patterns are taken into account. I know that's the big picture think that's happening with regards to affordable housing and the lack thereof in cities like mine. But we have portions of the west side that double or triple or even quadruple every single day because of so many people coming in to work there. And there aren't good transit options available. The freeways are totally clogged. A lot of poor folks are filling up the buses, and they're oftentimes passing by bus stops just because these are double buses sometimes, the special kind of bendy buses as they call them in London. So I'd love to get a sense of the extent to which you're taking into account commuting patterns and where people work as well as where they live.
Sure. Thank you for the question. In terms of how we define benefits to disadvantaged communities, we worked very closely with the Air Resource Board on that and came up with specific examples of how you can conclude a project is benefiting a disadvantaged community. And it's things like improving a service, for example, adding service frequency for a bus, or extending a new rail line to that community, improving use by transit passes and other things like that for the community. And so if you're improving a service to a community, that should extend to where they're going. They can get on a bus, or they could get on an improved light rail system and ride either if they're starting at a disadvantaged community, they can go to their place of work that might not be one, or if they're starting in a place that's not a disadvantaged community but traveling to one for work, then that would also count in a disadvantaged community assessment. So I hope that answered your question. It's really that corridor that may have one stop in a disadvantaged community, but may have other stops as well that go beyond that disadvantaged community.
Right. So so it makes me happy that you kind of see the problem. Mm-hmm. I just want to, is that actually going to happen? I mean, you said it should take it into account.
Right.
I absolutely agree with you.
Right.
Is it going to take it into account, I guess, is the question. Because I'm some of the way that I've seen transit money flow around LA, I don't think always does.
Mm-hmm. Well, where we are now is we've gotten about 20 applications for the operations program, and we are assessing these kind of questions in real time. For example, we're asking our applicants to show us a map of the disadvantaged community and show where that service increase is, or that service improvement is relative to that map of the disadvantaged community. So we think we're getting the data to verify that in fact the service is there, and of course ongoing reporting and audit to make sure that service continues with the state funds that go to that purpose.
Okay. The other question, kind of along the same lines, but through a different lens, how are you taking into account the fact that, you know, it takes certain kinds of transit investments to get wealthier folks out of their cars into public transit? I mean, it's very doable. It's been done in many cities. New York is, of course, a perfect example of this. But can you talk a little bit about the analysis that we go through to sort of see what it might take someone in a wealthier part of LA or San Francisco to get onto the train? Mm-hmm. And then the concomitant impact on greenhouse gases and the emissions in the city?
Well, we're finding in the applications received on the operations, there's certainly a wide variety of transit. And you know, as you look to the different agencies that provide transit service, I think well over a couple hundred of them, and you know, they're all around the state. Some include disadvantaged communities, some do not. So they employ different strategies to do that. Certainly in areas where you see a robust commuter rail system, the Bay Area with BART, Los Angeles, Southern California with Metrolink, where you see a lot of diverse income ridership, I think you see transit systems that are faster than driving a car, and cheaper than driving a car when you consider parking and all of the other costs. So I think there are examples where that transit service can be the best option for people regardless of income levels. It just gets them to where they need to go faster, more reliably, and in many cases at a lower price as well.
I just wanted to thank all three of you. I really appreciate working on the criteria, because I think it's very important that if we're going to be doing these 3-year, we're going to have a legislation that's going to discuss whether we should have 3-year, 10-year, how we do those horizons. But the first thing we need to have is we need to have measurement and, you know, the criteria that we make judgments on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and whether or not it's cost effective, what kind of projects you select in terms of the cost effectiveness and meeting the goals for the greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm very interested in looking at the budget this year, especially in that regard, because this will be the first budget we'll have a large amount of money. You want to say it that way? For transportation-related projects, and quite frankly, I'm a little skeptical of the way it's laid out right now, but I'd like to see, you know, show me how it works and see how we can improve our greenhouse gas emissions as well as meet the goals that we have in our state for the economy. So thank you.
Before we excuse you, I do have a sort of a question. There's been a theme here about the biggest bang for our buck. And I'm very interested in collaboration that energy, Caltrans, and Air Resources have with our other agencies, like the EDD, our court system, resources, and also with the private sector. So that we're trying to get these greenhouse gas emissions, and of my interest in adaptation, embedded throughout the state system. So I guess my first question is that when you have these emerging technologies, that's great. How do you balance that against the existing technologies so that we get the biggest bang for our buck? The handout that we have on the low carbon transportation, I mean, it's wonderful that we have financing programs for low income people to purchase a hybrid or plug-in. But I'm suggesting, or their replacement for new hybrid plug-in and zero emissions, but perhaps a 2011 Civic might be an extremely important improvement to their current 1979 Pontiac that is breaking down. And how do we reach those people before they get to pick and pull? And then we ask them for, as the state does, the volumes of documentation so that they can qualify for all these things and across the agencies.
Yeah, I can start, Chair Wachowski. It's a great question, and a question that when I referred to the three-year investment plan, the first investment plan that was submitted to the legislature, and the next one I mentioned will be January 2016, included a range of opportunities for GHG reductions, but it got to that very important question, or teed it up by virtue of opportunities that were identified. It was, what is the mix? Because you certainly want those near-term GHG reductions. But some of those near-term, I'm going to use freight as the example. A slight improvement, let's say a slightly more efficient truck, it's going to be on the road a very long time. And moving to something more transformative that is actually going to yield much more significant benefits, maybe a much better choice in the long run when you think of not just GHG reductions, but NOx and diesel PM. So the concept that was represented, and I would say it was represented even the appropriations, were to look at, and I'm going to use the appropriation that ARB got as the example. The appropriation included, on the light-duty side, some very clean cars, but they're available commercially today and included BEVs, battery electrics, and plug-ins. But it also reflected, and this is the process that we went through a public process, the opportunity to transform to the freight sector to much lower emission technologies, which required, in some cases it's electrification, in some cases it's hybrids. Some of those cases, the technology isn't fully commercialized. It was priming the pump and moving them forward, realizing that to get us to the healthy air quality standards we're aiming to get to and to get significant GHG reductions, it's going to require something more transformative. So even in that investment plan, there was this balance that is reflected in the question you just asked.
Okay. Thank you very much. You have something you wanted to add?
Well, I was just going to add, from the Energy Commission's perspective, we do work with EDD, we work with the Employment Training Panel, we work very closely with our workforce training component there that we have of our program. We also work with the Department of Food and Agriculture, for example, with the Division of Weights and Measures. So if you think you're getting a kilogram of hydrogen, they're making sure that you're actually getting a kilogram of hydrogen. And so we do work very well with one another. A good example with my sister agencies here on the charging infrastructure is the Energy Commission's working on the charging infrastructure. The Air Resources Board is trying to help with the incentives to get the cars out there, and Caltrans is helping with the signs and all of the other things. And so we do work together to help move these forward. One other thing I'd say about the private sector is they're also on the Energy Commission's advisory committee that we have for how we are spending our alternative and renewable fuel and vehicle technology program dollars. And the Energy Commission, as you know, we do that integrated energy policy report, which is just kind of a wonky thing, but the workshops that go along with it, I just got to be the lead on the update for last year, are really exciting because we can call in all sorts of experts, whether they're from universities, from the private sector, from the legislature, from our sister agencies, from federal agencies, whoever's kind of the thought leaders in that space, to really have a good discussion and dialogue about some of the issues that are challenging California. And so we always try to do that as part of our IPER process. So I just wanted to add some color to what you asked.
Thank you. Thank you for attending our meeting. Appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
We'll have our next panel. We have 7 individuals representing a varying perspective on the subject, so we'll have them come forward at this point. And we'll have it will go on the order in the agenda. So welcome everybody. Okay. Simon, You guys,